million people. The average adult reads at the 8th grade level, but 1 in 5 read at the 5th grade level. In terms of clinicians, only about 50% can recognize signs of limited health literacy in their patients. And from an economic standpoint, it has a $200 billion impact on healthcare, which is quite significant. So bottom line is, in terms of what we need to be thinking about today, is that limited health literacy is a very strong predictor of negative outcomes. If you're like me, you realize pretty quickly that knowing something and knowing how to communicate something are two completely different skills. And so I use this quote from George Bernard Shaw quite often when I give this type of presentation. The single biggest problem with communication is the illusion it has taken place. And I think that happens a lot of times in interpersonal communication, but I see it a lot in healthcare communication and patient-centered communication. There are many times where I've seen my students and young professionals explain something, and the patient doesn't respond, and the student moves on and assumes that because they said it, the patient understood it. They don't check, they don't use teach back, they don't use other approaches to confirm whether the patient understood it. They don't necessarily present the material in a way that's actionable. And so this is a problem that I've seen in new clinicians. This is a problem I've seen in my students in class when I'm teaching them and doing role playing. So it's clearly something that I feel there's a need to address, and I'm not the only one. And so ChatGPT is one way that I'm going to explain to you today how we can do that. One thing that concerns me is this statistic that 50% of patients incorrectly recall information shared during appointments. And of the 50% that correctly recall information, only 1 in 2 recall that information 24 hours later. So clearly there's a communication gap. And I'm guilty of this myself as a patient. I've gone to the doctor and I've had the doctor give me information, and then I go home and explain to my wife what the doctor told me. And sometimes I have forgotten the small details of what the doctor said. And I don't realize that until I have to explain it or articulate it to somebody else. And there's even been times, and I'm sure you've had this experience, where you've been in a healthcare encounter with a doctor and you didn't understand something, but you were reluctant to ask him or her to explain it to you because you were embarrassed, or there was some shame, or you felt like you were taking too much of the person's time, or maybe you felt like they didn't have the ability to explain it to you, or any number of factors that were interpersonal to you as an individual or to that interaction. And so I've been on the receiving end of that as a patient, and I try my best not to be that kind of professional that a patient can't explain to me or offer to me that they have concerns or they have questions. And I don't assume that they understand anything that I say. I do my best in most encounters to check for comprehension, because I don't want them to be one of those 2 patients that incorrectly recalls information after they've left the encounter with me. Written summaries are oftentimes, excuse me, proposed as a way to, give somebody something to take home, some patient education materials, and then they can read about diabetes management, or they can read about cholesterol levels, or they can read about, foot care, or whatever the case may be. But most of those patient education materials are too long, and they're filled with medical jargon. And this is true also in the field of speech-language pathology and audiology. Most of the patient education materials that we have created are not understandable and not readable by the average person in the United States. And the problem gets worse when you extend that to websites, for example. So if you go look on the websites for something about stuttering, or a voice disorder, or a swallowing disorder, or dementia, and you look at the information on the websites, that information is also presented in a way that's not understandable or actionable as well. So it extends not only to the interpersonal communication that one is having in a clinical encounter, but then the patients go home and they look something up on the internet, or they look it up on the internet before they come in, and they don't have a complete understanding of their condition and their health and what they're supposed to do about it, more importantly. So plain language writing is one solution that's been proposed, and plain language writing is that which is clear, concise, and tailored to a specific audience. So when I write summaries and I have my students write plain language summaries for their clinical evaluation reports, we have to tailor it to the patient or their caregiver or whoever the reader is of that report. And we have to try to take into account what we know about their literacy skills, their health literacy skills, their numeracy skills, as the professor was talking about this morning, and do our best to communicate in a health literate way using plain language. And the reason we want to use plain language is because it helps illuminate complex concepts and actions. So much of what we try to explain to people is complex. Sometimes it's complex to us. Sometimes it's second nature to us. And we don't stop and think that it's not necessarily second nature to the person who's receiving the information. So, most recently, I can give you a couple examples from the media. Bruce Willis has what's called frontal temporal dementia, and he has a language disorder called aphasia. And Wendy Williams, the talk show host, also recently was diagnosed with frontal temporal dementia and aphasia. So I've seen quite a bit of conversation either on the television or in written communication, like on my Apple News feeds and things about, what is frontal temporal dementia, what is aphasia, and I'm particularly drawn to the articles that talk about the aphasia. And I'm really struck by how insufficient much of the examples are and much of the descriptions are in terms of describing what aphasia is. One article I was reading recently, I thought to myself, if I didn't know what aphasia is, I would not understand what it is reading this article, because I have the knowledge and I'm barely understanding how it's being presented. And so I thought, well, here's somebody who's trying to educate the public about this condition, but did not do a very good job in doing that, for example. And then I've seen other examples where it's explained very well. And it's a complex concept, trying to explain to somebody what a language disorder is and how somebody can understand something or not understand something, or have words and sometimes and not have words another time, or be able to read or not be able to read, or write or not be able to write. It's hard for people to understand that somebody 1 minute can be communicating and the next minute not be able to communicate, and why that occurs. That's a very complex concept, and it's complex and it's difficult to communicate to the average person in a way that's meaningful and actionable. So the goal is, of course, for patients to be able to read, understand, and act on the information that we give them. Read, understand, and act on the information. So ChatGPT is one tool, not the only, one tool that we can use to perhaps help our students learn how to communicate in writing using plain language. And as you know, ChatGPT is a generative AI model that can simulate conversation, write essays, and explain concepts in various styles and formats. And if you follow, the world of AI, which I do kind of loosely, you'll see that every week something is changing, right? Since I started using ChatGPT, I started using it when it first came out in version 3. Now it's up to version 4. I have the Pro version. And I mean, week to week when I use it, it's exponentially better at what it does. It's faster, it's more complete, it's more natural to communicate with. The prompts are easier to generate. The output is more accurate. Of course, there are exceptions, but it's really scary how fast, for example, ChatGPT is evolving. And there's going to be a version 5 coming out probably by the summer, which is supposed to be exponentially even better than the current version. So clearly this is here. Clearly it's a tool, and hopefully we'll be able to use the tool for the betterment of our students and the people that they're treating. So it does understand context, and it can generate contextually relevant responses. So here on the right, I put an example of a prompt that I put in. What is plain language? And I'm teaching the students to do that so that they can learn what plain language is. It just seemed like a quick way for them to read and learn about plain language, in addition to going to, for example, the plain language website, the government website. So it tells us here at the beginning in the opening paragraph what plain language is, and it presented in a fairly decent way that's easy to understand. And then it lists, 7 or 8 key principles of plain language and describes what those principles are. And then it gives a little monologue at the end about plain language writing is not about dumbing down context and so forth. It's about communicating in a way that patients understand. So even in my undergraduate classes, which are preclinical classes, we talk about clinical disorders, but we don't do clinical training in the undergraduate courses. I have my students do a plain language module where they use ChatGPT or other sources to learn about plain language, and then tell me how they would apply that plain language principles and their knowledge about plain language to a clinical scenario that they might imagine themselves being in graduate school, or from their own personal experience. So this is just one example of just what is plain language, and ChatGPT will tell you. Now, if I asked ChatGPT to tell me this 3 different times, it would give me 3 variations on this answer, all essentially containing the same content, but perhaps organized a little bit differently, maybe using some slightly different vocabulary. But the essence of the 3 examples that were generated would be essentially very, very similar or interchangeable. As you probably can surmise, ChatGPT has limitations. It's very limited in its domain knowledge. It's very much more general knowledge. Although recently, OpenAI has something called Explore GPTs, which just came out about a week ago. And so you can use that tool to go to specific knowledge domain specific GPTs. So for example, I teach a course on clinical neuroscience, and there's a number of GPTs within ChatGPT that are specific to clinical neuroscience. So you could go into that GPT, for example, and ask questions, and it will have a knowledge base that's a little faster to access and a little bit more tailored to that particular content. And the individuals who develop those specific GPTs often have pre-formatted content as well that one can use to plug into a clinical course or a disorders course or something like that. There is bias, and that's been well demonstrated that there is bias using any generative AI model. And of course, then there's the ethical concerns about how the information is being used, what information is being input into ChatGPT, because it is public information as far as OpenAI is concerned. So anything you put in to ChatGPT is owned by OpenAI, and it's used to train the model. Now, OpenAI is moving to a privatized model. For example, at Arizona State University, now they've partnered where they have what's called a walled system, where nothing leaves the ASU domain or server, so it never goes back to OpenAI. And then once a session is complete, it's completely erased, unlike the typical ChatGPT. Microsoft is doing the same thing with Copilot. We have that here at UCF. If we use Copilot here, anything that we use in Copilot does not go back to Microsoft. And so it's a walled system and it's more secure. But even with that, one has to be careful about the information that is input because of either FERPA, HIPAA, or any number of other reasons, research integrity issues, and so forth. So there are some ethical concerns that way. And then also there's ethical concerns about the students using generative AI tools to cheat. And so one way that I've been addressing that with my students is to show them how I use it ethically and set the parameters by which I'm allowing them to use it, which are fairly loose. And I have found that in doing that so far, the students have been very respectful of the AI, respectful of the intent of the assignments. And as far as I can tell, maybe with 1 or 2 exceptions, I have not suspected that the information that I'm getting back from students on assignments has been AI generated. So I feel pretty good about that at this point in time. So it can assist in developing writing skills, offering feedback, and I'm going to give some examples of that, and then creating interactive learning experiences. So let me talk to you about a case example with the disorder of stuttering or a fluency disorder. So I thought that would be one that most people could relate to, and people oftentimes think of speech-language pathology synonymously with working with individuals with fluency disorders, and that is true, even though fluency disorders is what we call a low incidence disorder. It's about 1 in 100 individuals are affected with a fluency disorder. It's still something that has a profound impact on individuals. So I thought this would be a good case example that most people could relate to. So here's an example of using ChatGPT as a writing prompt. Okay, so the prompt reads up here: assume the role of a speech language pathology student and explain to a patient what stuttering is using a professional tone. That's the key. Do not use lists. So I don't know how well you can read this on your end, but it starts out saying, as a speech language pathology student, I'd like to provide you with a professional understanding of stuttering. Stuttering is a speech disorder characterized by disruptions in the natural flow of speech, and so on and so forth. And then in the second paragraph, it talks about the cause. In the third paragraph, it talks about how speech language pathologists approach stuttering from a treatment standpoint. It goes on to talk a little bit further about what treatment is. And then it talks about what the role of the speech language pathologist is in treating persons with fluency disorders and those that communicate with. So the prompt was to do it in a professional tone, and I think we can agree, if you read it, that it has a professional tone to it. But I also think we would agree, if we read it, that it's probably not understandable by the average person in the United States who has an 8th grade reading level. And it certainly is not written at the 5th to 6th grade reading level, which is what the Institute of Medicine recommends healthcare communication be presented at. So the next key is to analyze it, right? So I asked ChatGPT to analyze the passage using principles of plain language. So comparing it to the principles of plain language. So the first thing it did, and I highlighted this with the red circle, is it just gave me the Fleisch reading ease score, which is 27. And with the Fleisch reading ease score, the higher the number, the easier it is to read. So you can see that this is falling into, the lower quartile, let's say, suggesting that it's more difficult to read. And the Fleisch-Kincaid grade level is approximately 14th grade, which is, a sophomore in college. So clearly just doing a very quick readability analysis using ChatGPT shows that, yes, it's got a professional tone, but it clearly falls short of meeting plain language guidelines. So the next thing I did is I asked it to assume the role of speech. I'm sorry, I took the same prompt and I asked it to create a table for me with the principles on the left of plain language, how those could be addressed in the passage, and then suggestions for improvement. Okay, so you can see, for example, on the first row, it says clear and straightforward language. And it says here, adherence in the passage. It says the passage uses professional and technical language, which might be complex for some readers. And then over on the rightmost column, it says suggestions for improvement are to simplify technical terms like multi-factor, disfluencies, for example, and use more common language. And as we go through the table, row by row, in terms of logical organization, active voice, short sentences and paragraphs, and so forth, it tells me in the middle column how it adheres or does not adhere. And then it makes suggestions for improvement. So again, the original passage is on the right, and we've got this table here on the left to sort of guide us in terms of what ways that we might be able to improve this passage going forward to make it more readable and understandable and actionable. So in the next phase, the key would be to then ask it to suggest a writing revision. So what I did with this prompt is I said, assume the role of a speech language pathology student and explain to a patient what stuttering is using a conversational tone. Do not use lists. So you can see from the first paragraph, all right, let's chat about stuttering, imagining you're trying to tell a story and sometimes the words just don't flow out as smoothly as you want. That's kind of what stuttering is like. It's when the flow of speech gets interrupted and so forth. So within each paragraph, it has taken a more conversational tone, which presumably makes it more readable and would presumably lead to perhaps more dialogue between the patient who's reading the report or getting the information and the speech language pathologist. So this is an example of just prompting ChatGPT to take a different tone in writing the plain language summary. Some of the readability statistics for the new passage that you now see on the right are presented in this table on the left. So now the Fleisch reading ease has gone up to almost 75 out of 100, which makes it considerably more readable. The reading grade level has dropped now to nearly 6th grade reading level. And the use of passive sentences has dropped down to 0. And of course, one of the key principles of plain language writing is to try to present your writing in as much active voice as possible. So this is a dramatic improvement as well in terms of using active voice. It's essentially 100% active voice. So on the surface, just using basic readability principles and using basic plain language principles, this appears to be more readable. Okay. So taking the same approach, looking at the prompt on the right and the content that ChatGPT gave, we've looked over on the left and asked ChatGPT to, again, assess it for adherence and then also suggestions for improvement. So if we go back to the first row, rather, clear and straightforward language, and now says the passage uses clear and conversational language, making it easy to understand. And then it says it's well aligned with the principle, no changes needed. And then we could go down again through the remaining rows, looking at the principles on the leftmost column, and then looking at the adherence in the middle column, and then seeing if there's suggestions for improvement. So one example it gave on the bottom rows, it says layout and design elements. So it says in the middle column, as a plain language message, it doesn't incorporate specific design elements, but this is appropriate for the format. And one of the suggestions that it makes for improvement is, for longer text, consider using headings or bullet points to break up information. Okay. So I then asked ChatGPT to compare the two passages. Again, on the left, you have the plain language criteria. In the middle column, you have the assessment of the professional tone passage. And in the rightmost column, you have the assessment of the conversational tone passage, just to do sort of a side-by-side comparison. And again, I have the students do this so that they can learn, what the middle column is like and what the rightmost column is like, with the goal that they should be closer to the rightmost column than the middle column when they're going to write. Okay. And then I thought it would be illustrative to ask ChatGPT to write an ideal plain language summary of what stuttering is. So it created this, fake report essentially. I go, dear patient, and then it puts a prologue at the beginning, and then it talks about, with headings, what is stuttering, why does it happen, our approach to therapy, your unique journey, salutation at the end, and so it gives a format that a student could look at and have a model for how they might construct their own report that's specific to the patient that they've evaluated. And this plain language summary would accompany the professional report, which would be written for, another speech language pathologist or another healthcare provider. But this plain language summary would sit atop of that, and the patient would have both forms of communication. Now, in looking at this report, you can see that one of the things it doesn't do is it doesn't include graphics. And we know that some of these non-text elements can be very important in enhancing readability and patient engagement with written material. So one of the things that I asked ChatGPT to do was to suggest non-text elements. So it gave a list of non-text elements on the left, like related to headings and subheadings, bullet points, images or icons. And it gave some suggested application of what some of those non-text elements might look like. So for example, under headings and subheadings, it talks about, using the headings to introduce the main topic, which it did. Images or icons include simple icons or images next to key points, like a speech bubble for talking tips or a brain icon for neurologic aspects. And you can see it's rather generic, but it gives the student an opportunity to say, okay, how could I enhance this report with non-text elements? Okay. So then I asked it, what would be some of those images and icons that could be used? And so it suggested some, like a speech bubble, brain icon, light bulb icon, check mark icon, and so forth, that you can see, it gave 9 examples. of potential icons that could be used or images that could be used to enhance the report. So there are a number of free and or paid image generators. The most popular one right now is Midjourney, and I have a subscription. It costs $20 a month, and it's a generative AI for images. And then within OpenAI and within ChatGPT, they have a product called DALL-E 3, which is the current version. I've put the QR codes there, so I'll leave them up for a minute if you want to snap the QR code, and it'll take you to the websites for Midjourney and for OpenAI for the DALL-E product. All the images that you've seen in this presentation today, I generated using either Midjourney or DALL-E. And it didn't take very long. In DALL-E, it was a matter of, 10 or 15 seconds of me putting in a prompt and then getting an image, and then either liking the image or maybe modifying my prompt slightly. With all of these image generators, the more specific you can be, the more specific your image is going to be. So you have to think about what elements that you want in the image, but they're pretty accurate, and they give you multiple examples. So you might have, 2 or 3 versions of the same image. So I'll show you an example of that. So in ChatGPT or within DALL-E, I put in create an image of a college-age female reading a prescription with a confused look on her face. So I got these 3 images, and that was just the simple prompt that I put in there. I could have made it much more specific, related to any number of features related to the individuals, and it would have changed it. I could have changed their age, their hair color, their ethnicity, what angle they were looking at the material, the background, the lighting. It could go down a complete rabbit hole of specificity, which for the most part one doesn't need, for a presentation like this or for a basic graphic or infographic. You don't need to be overly specific. And again, it took less than a minute to generate these 3 images. And all the other images that were in the presentation were generated very, very quickly, and they're all free. So when we think about ChatGPT, it certainly can serve as a writing assistant for us, particularly not only for us, but I think for student clinicians as well, that are in the health professions. I think it can aid in the adoption of plain language to communicate in writing with patients and their care partners. And I think it can enhance communication and promote health equity. And of course, our goal is always to have better health outcomes. So I've found it to be a very useful tool. My colleagues, Sam and Bonnie is my former doctoral student who's now at Missouri State. Sam Atchison is an audiologist at my former institution in Arkansas in Little Rock. And so we've been giving these presentations in various formats to different audiences. And we've learned a lot from engaging with other people who are either using generative AI or are thinking about using generative AI. We've gotten some good examples of what we can do within our own discipline. But for the most part, we've been presenting to people outside of our discipline because we believe that these tools can be used and are applicable across healthcare disciplines, whether it's medicine or the allied health professions in general. So I'm really glad that you all participated today and attended my session. And we have quite a bit of time now to have a nice discussion about generative AI and how we might use ChatGPT for plain language. So I welcome any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Richard. That was very informative. Any questions? And you can just unmute yourself if you're inclined to ask them verbally, or you can add something to the chat. I'll start off with a question. I think your session really illustrated the importance of the prompts that you add, and it was just really fascinating to see your thought process in terms of what were some of the prompts that you used to both generate results and then refine those results, the things that I would have probably never thought of. And it's interesting to really kind of see how other folks are tackling some of these things. One of the things that you asked ChatGPT to do was to do a readability analysis, I guess, with Flesch Kincaid. And I was just wondering about that piece because a lot of folks who, work on simplifying materials and working on plain language materials use some of those readability tools and formulas. In your experience, is ChatGPT, you can go and pay services to go ahead and subscribe to various websites to kind of give you some analysis, but is ChatGPT to the point where if you say, hey, can you do an analysis with these 3 different readability formulas, they're going to give you something just as good as, if you're going through one of these paid subscriptions?
Yes, actually, I have a software program that I've been using for many years now. And it's comparable. It's not as extensive. It doesn't, some of these software programs will give you, 100 different formula. But if you're taking the basic formula like SMOG, for example, if you're taking Fleisch-Kincaid, Fleisch reading ease, any of the other more traditional measures that are typically used, including some for other languages, like the SOL, for example, I have found it to be comparable. I mean, actually identical when I put passages in. You bring up a good point, though, about, this concept of, you and I have talked about this before, junk in, junk out, right? So you're only going to get out of the GPT what you put into it. And so if you're very general, you're going to get very general information. If you're more specific, you're going to get more specific information. So you have to think about what is the output that you're seeking. And I always start with who is the learner, like who is the reader of this information. So it goes back to what the professor was saying this morning about numeracy, right? Like, what's the point? What am I trying to communicate? So in the plain language summary, what is the information that I consider to be the crucial information to be in that plain language summary for that given communication disorder, let's say. And then I prompt ChatGPT to, as specifically as I can, to make sure it gives me that information. Now, one of the things that I learned early on when I started doing this about a year ago was that there was some benefit initially at being less prescriptive about what it gave me, because sometimes it would give me things that never even occurred to me, right? So I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. It gave that piece of information. I would not have thought that that was a relevant, point to address in a plain language summary. So it broadened my own view of what might go into a report. And once my own view became a little bit more solidified, then I was able to prompt ChatGPT more specifically to give me the information that I was seeking, right? And that I thought would be most beneficial to my patient. So yes, the idea of, the more prescriptive you can be with the prompts, the more descriptive the information is that you're going to get at the end. And the beauty of it is that you can ask it to regenerate the response based on the same prompt. So, there's an icon where it looks like an arrow that's going counterclockwise. You just click that regenerate prompt as many times as you want, and it will give you, alternate versions, right? It'll give you iterative versions. So if you get one version and then you put a slight prompt in that says, revise it in the following manner, it'll take what it just wrote for you and then revise it specifically based on the iterative information that you asked it to generate. So there's endless possibilities, and as any other tool, you can go down a rabbit hole. Bottom line is you still have to be responsible for knowing the information. And that's true. I don't care if we're doing this for plain language writing or anything else. The content expert is us, not the generative AI, right? Not the large language model. We have to ultimately read it and make sure that it's accurate before we sign off on it or before we share it with other people. And I emphasize that repeatedly to my students. And I've used examples where I've had students try to generate something, and I've asked them to see if they could catch errors in ChatGPT in generating something. And occasionally they do. They'll catch an error. It'll describe something incorrectly or perhaps rather incompletely, which could lead to a misinterpretation. So right now I'm just using it in an exploratory manner. I haven't done any, rigorous research to show that it's a tool that can enhance their skills, but that's what I'm hoping to do today's presentation for, is to generate some thought among other people about ways that we can do that.
It is interesting that if you're asking questions, sometimes, at least it's been my experience, on topics I'm not very familiar with, it generates information that's questionable sometimes, and you got to kind of do some additional research. I don't know if there's a sort of a best practice to go to another AI generator like Copilot or one of the other ones and ask it to kind of check the information, because it can be dangerous. It's given me responses on some of the stuff I am more familiar with that I know is inaccurate, and
Right.
danger there, right?
Absolutely. There is an absolute danger, and I emphasize that to my students a lot. I also emphasize it to my patients, because I recently had a patient who went into ChatGPT to try to learn something. They just basically wanted to bypass Google Scholar, essentially. And a lot of people are using ChatGPT or any of these other generative AIs as a bypass for Google Scholar, which there is no comparison between Google Scholar and generative AI. I mean, they're two completely different tool sets, and you can't confuse one for the other. And the best is always to go to the more reliable sources of information like Google Scholar. But this is a starting point, right? So I've used Claude, which is a product, free product. Gemini now is the Google product. Copilot is the Microsoft product. And then we have ChatGPT, which is OpenAI's product. I'm taking a course right now on generative AI for teaching that's being offered by UCF. We meet once a week. And our very first week, we put the same prompt into 4 different generative AIs to see what information they would each give. And each had its strengths and weaknesses. You know, some are more conversational, some are less conversational. So I'm using ChatGPT because I'm the most familiar with it, and I find it the easiest to use myself. That's because I was kind of an early adopter of it myself. But I've used Copilot, I've used Bard, which is now Gemini, and they each give a little bit of different information. So I don't think it matters necessarily which one you use. I just think it's the idea that you're using generative AI to teach the skill of plain language writing.
Georgia had a question. I'm curious why in your prompt to ChatGPT, you asked it to not use lists. I found that creating short lists can help readers, especially when they are skimming material.
Okay, part of the reason I did that was I initially wanted the students to see what the information would look like in a narrative form, because I wanted them to appreciate the complexity of the wording, or perhaps the simplicity of the wording that went into the prompt. I agree with you that using bulleted lists can be very effective. One thing that I have found with ChatGPT in particular is unless you tell it how many bullet points you want in the list, it goes bullet list crazy. I mean, I've actually asked it to give me information about a topic, and it's given me 20 bullet points. And so sometimes there can be bullet point overload, I've noticed. I suppose with some massaging of the prompts, there's ways to limit that. But I agree with you. I mean, bullet points are effective. But in this initial stage, I was trying to avoid it because I wanted the students to get a fuller sense of the generative nature of the large language model. But that's a simple prompt. We could just add that in to that report and say, create, you know, bullet points for each of the sections of the report, 3 bullet points, 3 key bullet points. If you use the word key or clinical takeaways or actionable items, or just depends on what prompt you want to use. You can actually prompt it to modify the report.
And if you use the word key or something like that, it would probably give you the priority bullet points if you're limiting them, I hope.
You can tell it how many. You
Yeah.
you can absolutely do that. Yep.
Any additional questions?
So I'm curious from the audience, how do you teach plain language writing? Because I don't know who all is in the audience in terms of background, but we've got what, 30 people in the audience. So how are those of you in the audience who are training clinicians, how do you teach them plain language writing? Anybody willing to share?
You willing to share? Just unmute yourself.
Well, how might, since nobody's willing to share, how might somebody now take this information and use it? Not necessarily the exact way I'm doing it, but just in terms of a variation on it, an application of it, a modification of it. I'd be curious for my own learning how one might use the information.
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Good morning. Good morning, or good morning. So I am a case manager, and we help teen parents. And a lot of times they have lower than like a middle school education level, and so it's really important for us to like use plain language. So I think I'm going to be using this, especially when we're teaching them about parenting education. So for example, when we talk about like safe sleep, sometimes it gets like very technical, and I think that using this, we'll be able to like present the information like in a way that they'll be able to like easily digest it more, because a lot of times they might have like issues like understanding it, especially if like their family members are telling them something different, and we're telling them like, no, this is like the safest way for the baby to sleep, things like that. So I think that's how I'm going to be using it.
Great.
Basically, like, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. Anybody
Yeah.
else?
Nicole shared in the chat that she said, I don't teach students, but I think this information will be helpful in training an incoming communications coordinator to ensure our materials are written in plain language and using ChatGPT as a resource.
Great. That's great. One of the things I've also used ChatGPT for along the lines of plain language communication, not necessarily plain language writing, but just patient-centered communication, is that when I've been in class with the students, for example, and we've done role playing. So I'll have, one student pretend they're the patient that's had a stroke, and the other student is the speech pathologist asked to explain what aphasia is, for example. And we role play. And one of the things that I've done, we do the traditional role playing and we give each other feedback, and I kind of shape their communication. But lately what I've been doing is I've been saying, okay, to the student who's the speech language pathologist, I want you to type in what you actually would say into ChatGPT. So the student will type in what they were going to say, basically a script of what they were intending to say. And then I'll say, okay, ask ChatGPT now to analyze that for clear communication. And, every time they do this, initially, it comes back and it's like way too complex, way too complex, way too complex. And then I've said, ask ChatGPT how you might revise that script that you were just about to deliver extemporaneously, but how might you improve how you say that? And so it's done so. It said, change it this way, change it that way, use shorter sentences, emphasize this first, this second, this third. And it hasn't changed the essence of the communication. It has just been a tutor, basically telling it the same thing I would have said on the fly. And then the student looks at it and then applies that sort of script, if you will, in their own style to communicate with the patient. So we've been doing a little bit of that. And the students really get engaged with that, and it makes them think, about how they're doing it. And then some of them will put in alternate scripts. And so sometimes I've had, 2 or 3 students share whatever the script would be for the same scenario. And we take a little bit of this one, a little bit of that one, a little bit of this one. And so I teach the students, I say, before you have your clinical encounter tomorrow with that patient where you've got to explain the report, practice using ChatGPT, put your script in, massage it, shape it to where you're comfortable with it and where you're getting feedback that would make you feel comfortable, and hopefully more actionable results will come from that when you share the information. So there's less sort of learning on the job, if you will, or learning by mistake, and sort of circumventing that or getting ahead of that and getting them to just a little bit higher level before they walk into that encounter. So I think there's some possibilities to do that as well, in terms of training our students at any level, or anybody who has to be a patient educator, not necessarily a health provider.
Dawn shared in the chat, I utilize ChatGPT to input passages I have written and ask it to add elements I might be missing.
Good.
I also use it to whittle down my communications to more digestible length.
Absolutely. I struggle with that you know, because we all know so much and we want to share so much that we forget sometimes that it can be information overload. So yeah, I have found that it has really helped me be more concise in my professional communication with patients, even after 35 years of doing it.
Jackson commented, I think what you said about making sure patients or people understand information is important. Don't just assume when there's silence that information was understood. I like to share resources too, like Medline Plus, that are more driven to general populations. I think that the patient being a participant in their healing process is important.
Mhm.
When they want to be involved, it can improve patient outcomes. Thanks for sharing.
Absolutely, thank you.
I know that, well, I've read that future versions of generative AI will eventually start to allow people to prompt AI to write things in their voice, which is kind of interesting. So they,
Yes. Actually, the current version of OpenAI has personas. I haven't explored it yet because I just wish I had more time to do these things, but I have my regular professor job, so I don't have a lot of time to, you know, go down the rabbit hole, and it's very addictive. But yeah, there are personas that you can create actually in all of these AIs now, where you can train it to write in more or less your own style, right? Or create scripts that are in your own style. It takes some training and it takes some time, but it certainly can do it. Yeah.
okay.
And actually, Microsoft now has a project going. They're actually testing Copilot here at UCF on a small user group. I declined to be part of it because I just didn't have the time. But there's a small user group where they're going to use Copilot to essentially scan all the contents, for example, of my that I have in my hard drive or on the server that's related to my material. And then I could ask it to, for example, create a PowerPoint presentation on, you know, the cerebral cortex and the functions of the different lobes of the brain. And it would take my content and create presentations based on existing content that I have, which I may have across 20 different slide sets. So for, you know, 7 different courses, and generate it based on my own content as opposed to what's in their large language model.
Right. Okay.
And that's, you know, and it'll generate emails, it'll auto-generate emails, which I don't trust it to do. But it's getting to the point where it can auto-generate email responses and, you know, all those other kinds of things. But getting back to the point for students, I think it's a great tool and I think there's a lot of potential and the students are really engaged with it. There's a free version of it, which does, you know, for this purpose, you don't need the paid version. You can use the free version, the 3.5. And, you know, like anything else, the younger generation of students, they're teaching me things that I didn't even know because it's more native to them. You know, I'm a 61-year-old guy, so I'm not as quite up on the technology as a 22-year-old. And sometimes they come to me with prompts that I never would have thought to put in because their brains are just, you know, wired that way because that's the generation they're a part of.
It may be worth noting too, if my understanding is correct, that certain AI tools like Copilot will draw from the internet in real time, whereas ChatGPT doesn't do that, correct?
Correct. I think it's capped right now at 2022. It might be September of 2022, but the new version that's going to come out is going to be up to date.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's going to be up to date.
Okay.
So
Well,
I don't use it for research purposes or things like that for that very reason, Greg. But for these kind of tasks, it works really well where you don't have to have, you know, time sensitive current data. But you're just trying to teach conceptual things. All of the AIs work really well at teaching concepts.
right. But if you are looking to use it as a tool to gain information, you got to keep that in mind. It might be some older content there.
Right. And a prompt that's very useful that I have found is to use a prompt that says, teach me how to explain the following concept to X audience. So for example, you could put in a prompt that says, teach me how to explain plain language or how to teach plain language to an audience of speech language pathology students in their first clinical course, something like that. And then it will show you the best way to teach that concept, or a way to teach that concept to students. And you could get 2 or 3 or 4 different versions. You could ask it 3 or 4 different generations of how to do that. And it will give you some very good suggestions on how to actually teach that concept. I've prompted it to say, what in-class activities can I use to teach plain language to a group of 30 students who are first learning about health communication? And it's giving me in-class activities to do. I prompted it to ask for out-of-class activities. I prompted it for group activities. I prompted it for homework assignments that I could give. So from a pedagogical standpoint, for those of us that are teaching plain language or teaching any concept, it's a great tool for teaching pedagogy.
Absolutely.
So that's another sort of tangent to this plain language issue. It'll actually teach you how to teach plain language.
Yep. Or a range of other topics. There's a lot.
Yeah, or a range of other topics. Sure. Yeah.
Any other questions before we adjourn? Okay. See. Sorry, was there somebody? Okay. I think that will do it. Sure. Thank you so much. This was very informative. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise around this topic. I'm sure if you give this session again next year, it'll probably be quite different, since this seems to be evolving technology almost by the week, I think, isn't it? In terms of what's changing in the world of AI. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I'm going to actually be giving it here at UCF in another month, and I'm going to have to update it because it's going to change between now and March when I have to do this again. Yeah, so for sure, which is what I like about it. So it kind of keeps me engaged. So thank you all for participating and being here today. I really appreciate it.
And if you can please take a few moments to complete the session evaluation. All the evaluations are on the one form, but this would be for the first round of sessions. And I've also included in the chat the link, just in case you don't have it. I think most folks do, but that's the link to the portal, and that'll give you access to the next round of sessions that start at 11:30. So very good. See you then. Thanks.
So Greg, in the chat, is there the link to the next sessions? I think he said that. Oh, there we go. Right.
Or sorry, toward the end.
Yeah, let me just copy it there. Okay.
Well, thank you, Richard. That was great. I learned.
You're welcome. Thank you for facilitating the conversation.
Yeah, I think this is you really got me thinking about how to do the prompts, because I haven't spent as much time on ChatGPT or files as it's just personally fascinating to me. I've spent some time, and you kind of learn by doing, I guess, but you really did kind of a deeper dive than I traditionally do in terms of how you can get very specific on some of the prompts to get some really sort of uniquely catered answers. So that's really
prompt engineering is the future. I mean, all the big jobs right now. I mean, there's companies paying hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Netflix has a job right now, $300,000 a year for a prompt engineer.
Prompt engineering. I've never heard
that's
that's
yep. So there you go. So yeah, it seems to be upon us.
Wow.
So
okay.
All right, thank you.
In the future, yeah. We all got our own sort of mini prompt engineers, I guess, in order to not have to rely on some other professional to do it for us. But yeah,
exactly.
Whole new.
And I've actually asked ChatGPT to tell me what the best prompt is to get what I want out of it, and it will tell me.
Oh, wow.
Try that, yeah. When I fumbled around and I couldn't get what I wanted, I said, just what is the best prompt to give me this specific information that I'm seeking? And it'll tell me what the prompt is, and then I'll just copy that prompt in, and it'll give it to me.
Work? Does it work well? They come up with
works really well. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. See you in the next session.